done speaking, we will allot time for answering Q&A questions, so please feel free to ask your questions in the chat and we will answer them in the order in which they were received. Without further ado, I do not want to keep you guys waiting any longer. I will pass the mic to Omar Barghouti.
Thank you very much for having me. صباح الخير للجميع. I will start with my talk immediately to have maximum time for discussion. I understood from the organizers that English is the preferred language, so I will stick to English. Supporting the recent pogrom by fascist Jewish Israeli militias against Palestinians in Hawara near Nablus in the occupied Palestinian territory, and overtly inciting state terrorism, senior Israeli government minister Bezalel Smotrich, a self-declared fascist, said, quote, "I think Hawara needs to be erased. The state should be the one to do that," end of quote. Smotrich, however, is not the first Israeli leader to publicly embrace or threaten genocidal acts against indigenous Palestinians. One of the Labour Party leaders in 2008, Matan Velnai, threatened Palestinians with, quote, "a bigger Holocaust," if resistance groups did not stop their armed retaliation to Israel's criminal siege and violent attacks on Gaza. A recent error by Israel's censors has accidentally revealed secret documents exposing David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, his open support for wiping out Palestinian villages during the 1948 Nakba, with a minister in his government, in Ben-Gurion's government, admitting, quote, "Let us say that instances of rape occurred in Ramle, the ethnically cleansed Palestinian city of Ramle. I can forgive instances of rape," he said, "but I will not forgive other acts, such as forcibly removing jewelry from women," end of quote. Still, Israel's new far-right government is the most racist, fundamentalist, sexist, corrupt, and authoritarian ever, without masks. It constitutes an escalation in Israel's ongoing regime of colonial oppression against indigenous Palestinians, this ongoing Nakba, and simultaneously, a potential rupture, a break with the status quo in its far-reaching plans for judicial, social, and cultural reforms affecting predominantly Jewish Israeli society, and most likely Israeli economy as well. Nothing less than a reconfiguration of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine is beginning to take shape. This provides advocates of Palestinian rights worldwide, particularly in the BDS movement, an even more urgent responsibility and an opportunity that is unprecedented in 74 years. This opportunity is further amplified by the very recent Saudi-Iranian rapprochement brokered by China. As a senior Israeli journalist put it, quote, "Israel's dream of forming an Arab alliance against Iran was shattered on Friday, with the news that China had brokered the restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia." He continues, "China is taking the United States' place as an economic and strategic power in the region, a power that Israel has little influence over," end of quote. Moreover, with the internal Israeli turmoil, 90 Democratic members of Congress, for the first time ever, 90, are calling on the Biden administration to apply real pressure on Netanyahu's far-right government, as are 16 Jewish House Democrats. In parallel, over 250 Jewish American business leaders are reportedly threatening Israel's far-right government with serious financial and political consequences if it went ahead with its judicial reforms. Of course, erasing indigenous Palestinians from the picture and whitewashing Israel's regime of apartheid, they now fear, those more than 250 business leaders, Jewish American business leaders, they now fear that Netanyahu's reforms will erode what they call democracy, as well as minority and civil rights. Still, inadvertently, they're legitimizing BDS tools like never before in the United States. A very recent Gallup public opinion poll from a few days ago, actually, shows that after a decade in which Democrats have shown increasing affinity towards the Palestinians, Democrats' sympathies in the Middle East now lie more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, 49% versus 38%. It's unprecedented again. Among millennials, those supporting Palestinians are 42% vis-a-vis 40% supporting Israelis, all millennials from all parties. But opportunities alone do not lead to change. They only provide the fertile ground for it. We still need our agency. We still need to maximize our morally consistent and strategic movement building efforts to have enough people's power to realize a qualitative change in exposing the true face of Israel's regime of oppression and holding it to account as a contribution to the Palestinian liberation struggle. The anti-racist boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, led by the largest Palestinian coalition ever, has a special responsibility to further escalate our work to end state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's regime of oppression. This regime feels more invincible than ever. In broad daylight, with utter impunity, it is perpetrating massacres, killing our children, women, and men, besieging, bombing, suffocating, incarcerating, and bringing to the verge of starvation 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. It is ethnically cleansing our communities in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, the Jordan Valley, Al-Naqab, Masafer Yatta, Al-Khan Al-Ahmar, among others. It is brutalizing Muslim Palestinian worshippers and repeatedly desecrating Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Jewish fundamentalist Israeli settlers and their supporters are escalating anti-Christian racist attacks as well on Palestinian churches, Palestinian priests, and Christian symbols, desecrating Christian cemeteries in the open. In short, and as Amnesty International stated in its Watershed Apartheid report, Israel treats indigenous Palestinians as, quote, an inferior racial group. People worldwide, including in the US, are rightly horrified by the cost of living crisis, exacerbated by underlying structures of gross inequality, neoliberal austerity, climate calamity, resilient coloniality, and systemic racism. Still, indigenous Palestinians are asking for more meaningful solidarity, for intensifying efforts to end complicity in Israel's crimes perpetrated against us. But why should average Americans support Palestinian rights and BDS in particular, despite being so engaged and troubled with their own domestic justice struggles? There are 3 brief reasons. 1, the indivisibility of justice, as Angela Davis puts it, and the associated ethical duty to consistently stand in international solidarity with struggles against oppression everywhere. South African jurist John Dugard once said, Palestine has become the litmus test for human rights. He's referring to how the Global South measures the West's sincerity on human rights, partly based on how it deals with Palestine. The West's unabashed hypocrisy on Ukraine vis-a-vis Palestine today, for instance, has only aggravated global revulsion at the West's colonially patronizing pontification about human rights. The second reason why average Americans should care about Palestine is the intersectionality connecting the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality with struggles for racial, indigenous, economic, social, gender, and climate justice worldwide, including in the US. Israel's regime of oppression, a model for much of the world's far right, harms not only Palestinians, after all, but also millions of others around the world. Israel today is a partner of fascist groups in the West, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core, Look at Christian Zionists in the US. And it's partnering with far-right and authoritarian regimes worldwide, especially in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and so on. Israel sells its military security technologies and colonial doctrines as battle-tested, of course tested on us, on Palestinians. For instance, through the export of its military doctrines and weaponized spyware technologies like NSO's Pegasus, and its disinformation and election rigging services as a diplomacy tool, Israel has for decades been a culprit in not just illegal surveillance in the West, but also war crimes perpetrated by dictatorships around the world. The third and last reason for why average Americans should care about Palestinian rights and about joining BDS is the profound ethical obligation to do no harm and to repair harm done by you or in your name. This is particularly relevant for a US audience. If you're a citizen of a more or less democratic state like yours that is deeply complicit in Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, Saudi and Emirati massacres in Yemen, ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, or other grave human rights violations, your solidarity, starting with ending complicity, with doing no harm, becomes a moral duty, not charity. It's a moral duty. Israel has been designated as an apartheid state by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, not to mention many Palestinian, South African, and international human rights experts. The leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, also designated Israel as an apartheid system and described it as a, quote, regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, end of quote. Even a former Israeli attorney general recently wrote, you simply cannot be a liberal democracy if you operate apartheid over another people. It is a contradiction in terms because Israel's entire society is complicit in this unjust reality, end of quote. Last November, the leading Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq, published the most compelling report yet on Israel's apartheid as a tool of settler colonialism since the 1948 Nakba. Largely blaming BDS for this growing recognition of Israeli apartheid, the Israeli government last year approved allocating additional tens of millions of dollars to its war on BDS. This well-oiled war has included, in addition to heightened propaganda, especially the Brand Israel campaign, it included legal warfare or lawfare and the use of intelligence services to spy on the movement and its networks and to try to sabotage them. But why does Israel consider BDS such a, quote, strategic threat to its colonial regime? Because BDS is principled, ethical, effective, and widely popular. Inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle, the US civil rights movement, among others, BDS is rooted in a long heritage of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance. It was launched in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society, calling for ending Israel's 1967 occupation, upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their lands and to receive reparations, and ending Israel's system of apartheid according to the UN definition. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and committed to intersectionality, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Our movement targets complicity, not identity. A growing number of anti-colonial Jewish Israeli BDS supporters play a significant role in the movement. And the recent poll shows that 16% of all Jewish Americans support BDS, and the percentage goes much higher for a younger age group among Jewish Americans. They understand that there is nothing Jewish about Israel's siege, ethnic cleansing, massacres, land theft, and apartheid, and therefore there is nothing anti-Jewish per se in supporting BDS to end these crimes, to end settler colonialism. As dozens of progressive Jewish organizations have said, conflating opposition to Israel's regime of oppression and Zionism on the one hand with anti-Jewish hatred, discrimination, and racism on the other is an attempt to distort the very definition of anti-Semitism and to weaponize it to simultaneously silence advocacy of Palestinian rights and provide Israel with impunity for its crimes. This not only harms the Palestinian liberation struggle, but also the struggle against real anti-Semitism, as they put it. Moreover, as the BDS movement has consistently warned for years, the rising wave of Israeli-induced anti-Palestinian repression in the West, this new McCarthyism, will not stop at suppressing freedom of expression on Palestine. If this repression succeeds, with tens of states adopting anti-BDS resolutions, if that succeeds, no other justice movement in the US will be safe. Israel's anti-BDS lawfare has already become a template in state legislatures across the US, including New Jersey, for anti-democratic repression against campaigns for climate justice, for women's reproductive rights, and for Black and Brown voters' rights. For climate justice is a very important campaign, and they're really using anti-BDS legislation to suppress that. This phenomenon is already crossing the Atlantic as well, reaching the UK, for example. Israel has for many years recognized the strategic impact of the BDS movement and fought it accordingly. BDS campaigns have cost major multinationals massive contracts or severe reputational damage, leading some, like Veolia, Orange, CHR, among others, to end their entire business complicity in Israel. Most recently, Ben & Jerry's set a precedent among socially responsible companies by ending its business connections to Israeli apartheid and occupation. Giant sovereign funds in Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, among others, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have divested from Israeli or international companies and banks that are implicated in Israel's occupation. BDS has won the endorsement of major international labor union federations and farmers' unions in South Africa, Latin America, India, Europe, Canada, the US, together representing tens of millions of workers and farmers globally. Dock workers' unions, most notably in Oakland, California, not to mention Durban, South Africa, and in Italy, a beginning of a movement there, have refused or started to organize towards refusing the handling of Israeli ships. Mainstream churches in South Africa have endorsed BDS, while major churches in the United States have divested from complicit companies and/or Israeli banks. Major justice movements across the world have endorsed BDS. These include the Movement for Black Lives and the Sunrise Movement in the US. Ending US complicity in Israel's system of oppression against Palestinians requires principled yet strategic, gradual, goal-oriented campaigns that prioritize the following 4 points. 1, lobbying federal, state, and local government to defend our right to BDS as a matter of free speech, First Amendment, and to end those governments' deep complicity in Israeli apartheid, starting with an arms embargo, a military embargo, and cutting military funding to Israel. That is the absolute highest priority as far as policy is concerned. 2, pressuring city councils and public institutions, including universities and labor unions, to divest from and exclude from procurement all companies involved in grave human rights violations anywhere, including Israel's human rights violations. So we cannot push for an Israel-specific screen, human rights screen, but let's push for a general human rights screen and then use that to say, well, Israeli companies and international companies involved in colonies, which are war crimes, are illegal and you should stop dealing with them. 3rd, supporting the academic and cultural boycott of Israel and of its complicit institutions. 4, and last, joining strategic campaigns against the racist Jewish National Fund and against complicit corporations such as CAF, JCB, G4S Allied Universal, Hewlett-Packard, AXA, Puma, Barclays Bank, Hyundai Heavy Industries, among others. To end, apartheid Israel and its anti-Palestinian cohorts in the US are trying to silence advocacy for Palestinian liberation. It is having a chilling effect on many in the US. But here, in this case, in the US, they silence you with repressive legislation and policies. In Palestine, Israel tries to silence us with bullets, bulldozers, and bombs. Yet, we steadfast, we resist, we insist on our full menu of rights. Can we count on people of conscience in the US to shatter the walls of silence, to cancel your moral outrage, to channel your moral outrage into strategic mainstream campaigns that can finally tip the balance of power towards Palestinian freedom? Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I especially like how you mentioned that Israel treats indigenous Palestinians as an inferior group, because I do think that that is what settler colonialism is. It's just a greedy strategy to gain greater power over indigenous Palestinian people. And BDS is a way for us to reclaim that power, which will establish better liberation, not just for indigenous Palestinians, but for all oppressed people. We will now take time to answer any Q&A questions. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. The first question that we have is, in what ways do you recommend local SJP chapters to incorporate BDS in their work? And also, how do you think we as students can combat the illegalization of BDS on campus?
Okay, yes, thanks for this. Of course, several SJP chapters across the US already adopt BDS tactics and measures. We've had many, many successes. Tens of campuses in the US where student governments have adopted BDS measures, divestment, and so on and so forth. Now, the challenge is how to go beyond resolutions. Resolutions are extremely important. Let's not underestimate the symbolic value of passing a resolution at the student government level. Let's not underestimate the value of having some voice in the newspaper of your campus. Don't forget that many Zionists are all over the place in campus media, and we need more Palestinian and progressive voices in newspapers on campuses, because otherwise we're silenced. They're trying to silence us, to suffocate us, basically. So I think it's very important to go first to establish those resolutions, and second, to work with community organizations, with churches, with labor unions, with other justice movements in an intersectional way to push divestment, not from companies specifically involved in Israeli crimes, but to push for divestment at a university level, at a college level, from all companies involved in grave human rights violations. And we can help with that. There's Palestine Legal, of course, a legal support center that can also help with how to devise your resolution in such a way that all progressive groups on campus can agree with, and where the trustees of the university will have a very difficult time rejecting it. Why would anyone oppose divesting from companies and banks that are involved in grave human rights violations? You want to continue to profit from human rights violations? You want to continue to hire companies that are, making money out of suffering of masses of people? So that can help us a lot. And after we pass that general resolution to restrict procurement and investment and contracting companies that are involved in grave human rights violations, then we can push for the Israel-specific ones involved specifically in the settlements. That's the easiest part that we can push for, and of course, apartheid in general. One thing that's very important that I know SJPs are doing, which is coalescing in the national SJP to coordinate nationwide, because it does matter at the US level to have a national organization like an SJP. Another, and one final point, is to coordinate with us in Palestine. It's really important to coordinate. There's a lot we can do to help each other, to support each other, And we know how much they're trying to silence SJPs across the US. And so let's stand together on this, because we can connect student groups in the US with student groups in the UK, in Brazil, in South Africa, elsewhere, where there are other struggles that are, in India, for example, the largest student, I have to say this example, yes, the largest student coalition in India with 4 million members has endorsed BDS and has launched a campaign against HP, Hewlett Packard. It's very important to connect with that. It's just so inspiring to see, 4 million students organized in India and this union that supports BDS. So those are just some examples.
Thank you so much for that. The next question we have from an audience member is, some local Palestinian-owned businesses still sell products by Israeli corporations. So how do you recommend that we push these conversations internally as well?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was reading something else. Maybe I missed it.
Okay. So some local Palestinian-owned businesses still sell products by Israeli corporations. So how do you suggest that we push these conversations internally?
Okay, I personally think that after, let's say, a community center or student groups or a coalition of groups goes and tells a store that you should not be selling Israeli dates, especially now Ramadan is coming up. You should really stop selling Israeli products, especially those companies that are involved in violating Palestinian rights, especially those involved in settlements. Settlements are war crimes according to international law. How do you expect to convince non-Arab Americans to support our struggle when you, Arab stores, are still selling Israeli products, when you are complicit? Now, I don't believe in moral appeals alone. If moral appeals don't work, we need to name and shame those stores. We need to call for a boycott of those stores. Some people wouldn't like that. Well, but they're part of the community. Yes, so what? They're part of the community, but they're betraying us. They're betraying Palestinian rights. By selling Israeli dates, mostly coming from settlements in the occupied territory, they're betraying Palestine. They're throwing us under the bus. Why should we be so sensitive not to name and shame the stores? I wouldn't name and shame individuals, but I would focus on businesses. Because we in the BDS movement in general do not like to label individuals. We do not like to call people names. We do not like to insult individuals. But a store, a business establishment, it's perfectly fine to name it and shame it. This is a tactic we used during the anti-apartheid struggle when I was in school at Columbia University in New York. When we used to pressure many supermarkets and stores not to sell any South African products, there weren't that many South African products, but those that did, or those that dealt with South Africa, companies involved with South Africa, we would name them and shame them. And we would call on the community to boycott those businesses. That's a perfectly legitimate free speech issue in the US, and we should use it.
Thank you for your insights. It is definitely, sadly, a very common occurrence in our community. The next question we have is so somebody's asking, after the Presbyterian Church General Assembly passed our stand to support BDS, one member of a local church in Atlanta called me and said why the PACC USA wants to destroy Israel. How would you recommend responding to this?
Sure. Just for accuracy, the Presbyterian Church in 2014 did not adopt BDS. They adopted divestment. So it's a very measured response, basically, to Israeli crimes against Palestinians. And it took the Presbyterians 10 years to reach that decision. They were involved in dialogue with all those companies, Caterpillar and others, about their involvement with the occupation. And when those companies refused to budge, refused to end their complicity in war crimes, basically, finally in 2014, the Presbyterian Church USA decided to divest from several companies involved in the occupation and started pressuring, calling on the US government to end military funding to Israel, which is extremely important. Because it set a precedent, and because the Presbyterian Church is so important, it set a precedent because the United Methodist Church, a couple of years later, its pension fund decided to divest from all Israeli banks involved in the occupation, as well as G4S, a British security company that was involved in Israeli prisons, is still involved in Israeli crimes. And we still call for a boycott of G4S, which has now become Allied Universal. So now the lobby, Israel's lobby, and anti-Palestinian groups in the US started attacking the Presbyterian Church and its activists and its priests, everyone in the Presbyterian Church, exactly using such inflammatory language. You want to destroy Israel, you're anti-Semitic, blah, blah, blah. Progressive Jewish groups came out and said, ending complicity in war crimes, how would that possibly destroy Israel? In fact, in an op-ed I published in the New York Times, I answered specifically that question. I said, did boycotting the racist bus companies on Montgomery end the existence of Montgomery? It just fought racism. Did ending Jim Crow in Alabama destroy Alabama? Did ending apartheid in South Africa destroy South Africa? It destroyed racism. It destroyed a racist structure of oppression. It doesn't destroy the country, doesn't destroy people, for sure. It brings freedom, equality, dignity to everyone, equal rights to everyone. Why is it in the case of Israel that ending occupation, calling for boycotts to end occupation, to end settler colonialism, to end apartheid, is considered equivalent to destroying a state? There's only one way to understand it this way. If Israel's very existence is premised on maintaining settler colonialism and apartheid, where you cannot imagine the state existing if you took away settler colonialism, there's nothing left. Well, that's their problem, that's not ours. A state based on settler colonialism and apartheid has to be questioned internationally and has to be boycotted internationally. We, indigenous Palestinians, will not protect a structure of oppression that is oppressing us. But let's reject this inflammatory language and say this is consistent with the church's fulfilling its moral obligation to stop profiting from war crimes, from grave human rights violations. Because otherwise, the Presbyterian Church is investing in companies that are making a killing out of our killing, basically. That cannot continue. That should stop. That's a moral obligation for not just the Presbyterians, for all churches. This is why the United Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, and many, many other churches and denominations in the US have taken such bold decisions and started to divest. We need more. We need real divestment from every company in the UN database of companies involved in settlements. In the whoprofits.org, someone put in the chat, I completely agree, that's a very good resource, whoprofits.org, or the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers Investigate database. So we have 3 great databases of companies involved in the occupation and settlements. At the very least, forget the rest, forget denial of refugee rights, forget apartheid, just settlements and occupation. That should be enough to start with. All churches, all trade unions, labor unions have to divest from those companies. And that's not charitable, that's fulfilling a moral obligation.
The next question we have is, how can we call out the extreme nature of the current Zionist government without exceptionalizing it and giving liberal Zionists the space to argue that there is a good way to have a Zionist state, and without allowing them to unduly differentiate themselves from the current fascists in power?
I strongly suggest to check our just released analysis days ago of the Israeli government. It answers this question. It's a very long answer because there's nothing simple about answering this. It's on the bdsmovement.net, the front page. It says, analysis of the new Israeli government, challenges and opportunities. If someone can please paste that link in the chat box for everyone to get, I strongly suggest reading this. It's long. I'm not going to lie to you and say it's simple reading. It's not. It's simple. The language is not complex, obviously. It's not academic. It's written for activists, for everyone. It's 24 pages, but it's full of resources. It's really rich in resources, predominantly Israeli. Thank you, Rania. Predominantly Israeli and Zionist sources. In a nutshell, we believe in the BDS movement that Israel's new government is not just the most far right, the most fundamentalist, the most racist, the most sexist, you name it, corrupt, authoritarian, and so on and so forth. It simultaneously presents 2 paths. For Palestinians, it's a continuation of a 74-year-old system of oppression, but without masks, without cosmetics. It's uglier than ever. Unlike previous Israeli governments, this government does not feel the urge, given all the impunity and US support and European support, it doesn't feel the urge to even pretend that it's a democracy. When you have the most senior minister after Netanyahu, Smotrich, he's the second most important minister in this government, coming out openly saying, I'm a fascist homophobe. Clearly, he doesn't care about public opinion. He doesn't care what people think of him. That presents a huge opportunity. So on the one hand, it's a continuation of a very ugly system of oppression, but simultaneously, it's a very new era for Jewish Israelis. The changes that this government is working on introducing, the laws, the so-called reforms, are extremely far-reaching for Jewish Israeli society. And in our study of this government, you can see fact after fact how it is changing so much in reality. Basically, Israel has always been, they call it a Jewish democracy, as now being said even by main writers in the New York Times and elsewhere. It's always been an oppressor regime for Palestinians and a democracy for Jewish Israelis. So it's a democracy for Jews only, as Peter Beinart put it in the New York Times. That is true. Now, for Jewish Israelis, it has been very much a dynamic, robust democracy, while being an oppressor, apartheid settler colonial regime for Palestinians. This is what is being challenged now. This massive opposition to the government among Israelis is an opposition to the government's attempt to undermine settler democracy, what we call settler democracy. It's not true democracy. It's not democracy for all. Just imagine, I mean, just to bring it down to earth in the US, imagine the US tomorrow saying we're a Christian white state. And anyone who's not Christian and white cannot enjoy equal rights. I mean, you can be a citizen, you know, Sana and Juhaina. I mean, okay, we'll accept you as citizens, but not equal, sorry. You're neither white nor Christian. So tough, we cannot accept you as equal. And you know, any Jewish person in this call, sorry, you too cannot. And any Hindu, any non-Christian white person cannot be an equal citizen. This is the reality of Israel today. This is not something hypothetical. Israel has more than 60 laws that discriminate against citizens. Forget Palestinians in the occupied territory or forget Palestinian refugees, including in New Jersey. I'm talking about Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel are discriminated against in every aspect of life by law, not just by policy. This is the reality of Israel. And this is the democracy that this opposition wants to protect. They want to safeguard settler colonial privileges and settler colonial democracy, not real democracy for everyone, because they never believed in democracy. Israel never included equality even among its basic laws, the quasi-constitutional laws. So equality does not exist. It's not protected by law. The Supreme Court in Israel never defended equality. Neither has the Knesset. So what are they talking about? They're defending settler democracy, not real liberal democracy.
Thank you for that, and thank you for providing a strong resource for us to turn to. Again, for anyone interested, the link is in the chat. And unfortunately, in certain cases like Stephen Salaita, the major donors to the colleges are Zionists. So how do you suggest that we, especially as college students, fight against this?
It is not, and there's no easy answer, obviously, as Stephen Salaita's case has shown. Lawsuits are really important. Strategic lawsuits are really important just to deter Israel's lawfare, Israel's legal warfare. I mean, Israel and its lobby groups are using the justice system in the US to scare us, to shut us down, to have a chilling effect. So they say, let's say X is a Palestine activist at Rutgers, for example, then let's file a lawsuit against them and say they're anti-Semitic because they said Israel is an apartheid state. Now, obviously, this is not anti-Semitism, but you go to court and you have lawyers and you fight it out and it drags on for a year or months. And you're a student, you need to attend to your homework and your exams and your career. How can you be so involved with a lawsuit against you? So many students might think, you know what? Forget, yani, I love Palestine, but enough is enough. I want to graduate. I want my career. So I'd rather not do any Palestine activism. Unfortunately, that's the chilling effect that Israel is seeking and the lobby is seeking. And in quite many cases, they succeed. So how do we counter that? We counter that by involving groups like Palestine Legal that have won quite a few cases against this repression, against this McCarthyism, this violation of First Amendment, and have supported students and academics by working collectively. You can't fight it alone. You're too weak alone to fight it. Let's bring in every progressive force on campus and off campus to fight it out, because this is not just about you. It's not about this student at Rutgers that's fighting the machine. No, everyone should be worried about this machine of repression on campuses, because if they get away with it against Palestinians, against BDS activists, tomorrow it'll be against Black justice activists, women activists, Filipino student activists, Indian student, you name it. Tomorrow, everyone will face this repression, as we are seeing in anti-democratic laws being passed in Florida and in Texas and in Wisconsin and so on and so forth. One after another, they're taking the anti-BDS legislation, changing a few words, and passing it against women's rights, against fossil fuel campaigners, against gun control campaigners, and so on and so forth. So what we were saying 7-8 years ago has come true, that this repression will never stop at Palestine or at BDS. They will go after you. So we should use this to form big coalitions against this repression, and never to be coward and silenced and feel, oh, I'm alone, I'm weak, I'm a student. Yes, of course you're weak and you're a student. That's exactly why I bring in everyone else to fight it back institutionally, collectively, intersectionally, not by yourself.
What do you think of the double standards that welcome BDS-like protests taking place in Israel that are against the right-wing government's attempt to overhaul the judiciary? How do we seize on this opportunity?
Great question. As I've said in my talk, you have over 250 Jewish American businessmen that are effectively calling for divestment. Talk about unprecedented opportunity. So when we said it's an unprecedented opportunity in 74 years, we were not exaggerating. It truly is an unprecedented opportunity. Those same business people that have fought every company like Ben & Jerry's, or every company that has done the whatever little they could do to stop being involved in Israeli war crimes, all those businesses went after them. All those state legislators went after them. And now they're saying divestment from Israel is okay, as long as it's not for Palestinian rights. Divesting from Israel to pressure the dictatorial, authoritarian government because we want to protect Jewish democracy in Israel, that is fine, but protecting Palestinian rights, which have been denied for 75 years, is not okay. So let's show the hypocrisy. Basically, they're shooting themselves in the foot, in my view. They're legitimizing, inadvertently, without any intent, they're legitimizing BDS tactics. They're calling for boycott of Netanyahu, boycott of Smotrich. Even the BDS movement, we don't boycott individuals, we boycott states and corporations and activities, not individuals. They're calling for boycotts of individuals. They're calling for boycotts of think tanks and companies connected to the government and so on and so forth. Israeli businessmen are taking their money out. They're not saying hypothetically, if Netanyahu continues, we shall divest. They are divesting. Billions and billions of dollars have flown from Israel to Western banks, Switzerland, the US, and others. Billions of dollars. We don't know the exact figure, but if you read our research and the latest news, you'll find that to Swiss banks alone, until the end of February, billions of dollars had already been transferred from Israeli banks to Swiss banks. So divestment is happening, boycotts are happening, and they're calling for sanctions. Now there's massive pressure on the Biden administration to basically impose certain sanctions on individuals in the Israeli government. And it worked. Smotrich was not able to meet with anyone in the White House. They basically sanctioned him. The White House agreed not to meet with him. When was the last time that the White House imposed sanctions on a minister in the Israeli government? So we're seeing things for the first time, precedent-setting things for the first time. Let's use it, call out the hypocrisy, use the moment to push BDS measures for the right cause, for the right objectives, ending, dismantling this system of oppression, not just to put the cosmetics back on, put the mask back on to hide it. That's what the Israeli opposition is calling for. They're telling Netanyahu, stop shredding the mask to pieces. It took us 7 decades to build this wonderful mask of democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. And now you're just destroying it. Stop destroying our nice mask. Otherwise, you'll show our true ugly face of apartheid. And we can't have that. So they're legitimizing, inadvertently legitimizing BDS tactics, I think.
Thank you for continuing to share your strong insight. We will conclude with our last question. As solidarity grows, how can we make sure that the voices and needs of Palestinians are centered in BDS work, even if local movements are not always led by Palestinians themselves?
It's a very important question. It's a bit complex in the US, and we face that a lot in discussions with Palestinians in the US, because Palestinians would say, well, we are Palestinian and we are American. So we have an obligation to act on Palestinian politics, including internal politics. You know what's happening with the PLO, our sole legitimate representative. They're destroying it. We have those unelected, corrupt leaders and so on and so forth. Am I not required to do something about that? I mean, I'm Palestinian after all. GUPS and so on. We were just talking before this discussion. I was a member of the General Union of Palestinian Students, a proud member in the US. And we worked a lot. I was independent. I wasn't part of any party, but we worked a lot in GUPS. But at the same time, I was a student in the United States. I had to do something regarding US foreign policy because Israel's regime of oppression has made in the USA written all over it. So we have a massive, massive responsibility in the US to end US complicity at every level, university, city council, state, federal government level, Congress level, at every level in the US, you have complicity. They're invested in Israel bonds. Can we launch campaigns to divest from Israel bonds? Pressure, city councils, pressure labor unions to sell off Israel bonds that are led by Smotrich, the same self-declared fascist is the Minister of Finance responsible for Israel bonds. That's an opportunity. So Palestinians have this dual responsibility. As Palestinians, yes, they can be involved, and they are involved in Palestinian politics, but I think there's a huge responsibility to be involved in solidarity work as well. For us to play a role in every solidarity movement to push for divesting from Israel bonds, the Break the Bonds campaign, to stop joint training between Israeli and American police enforcement, to stop the American companies from being so complicit, and so on and so forth. There's a lot, divestment on campuses, churches, there's a lot to be done. We cannot stand aside in the US and say, that's solidarity. Let the non-Arab Americans do it, but we Arabs, we can't do that. No, yes, we have to do that. There's no option but to do that. So how to center Palestinian issues, Palestinian aspirations in this? Well, in BDS, it is centered already. The BDS movement is led by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society in Palestine as well as in exile. It is 100% Palestinian-led. It is 100% the guidelines of the movement, the strategies of the movement are set by the leadership, Palestinian leadership of the movement. So Palestine is centered there, but you have to adapt your tactics to suit the US particularities, which we call context sensitivity. So if you have a coalition in Clifton, in Rutgers, in Princeton, with a huge coalition with progressive Jewish groups, church groups, labor groups, and others, great. It doesn't have to be led by Palestinians. Let it be led by anyone who's competent and principled and strategic enough to lead it. But Palestinian voices, Palestinian aspirations are already centered. If they adopt a BDS campaign, Palestinian voices, Palestinian aspirations are definitely centered.
Can I just say Can I just say نورت عمر نورت New Jersey اشتقنا لك.
I don't know who's talking, sorry, I can't see.
ريما قاسم.
Oh, Rima, I thought that you sounded familiar. شكرا Rima.
Yes. Thank you so much. شكرا كثير إنك you joined PACC.
I'm glad I mentioned Princeton then.
Yes. خلاص, I'm gonna go. I'm in trouble already for speaking.
Okay, that concludes all of our questions. Thank you everyone for your engagement, and thank you Omar Barghouti for joining us. Do you have any closing remarks that you would like to add?
Just that I'm so proud of the work you're doing. When I saw the pictures of the center in Clifton, I lived in Clifton for a number of years. It was so inspiring to see the work you've done, to see all those young people, especially young women. It's just amazing with student activists and so on. We really rely on this generation of Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, to take the baton, so to speak, to take the lead and to continue the great work for Palestinian rights in the US. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I actually have one more question to add. What is the best way to coordinate our work in the USA with the work on the ground, Palestine, and build on each other's strengths?
Okay, well, I can answer only as far as BDS is concerned. Of course, there are other campaigns going on, and against the wall, the popular resistance groups against settlements and the walls, and Bil'in and Na'lin and Ma'asara and so on and so forth. But as far as BDS is concerned, just write to us and contact us, info@bdsmovement.net. Basically, that's the general email of the movement, info@bdsmovement, one word, .net. And let's coordinate, especially student work. We have PACC, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which coordinates with student groups worldwide, and we'll be more than happy to coordinate with SJPs.
Thank you so much for your insight. I can speak especially as a college student that being informed about BDS is always so important in improving our movement for Palestinian liberation. Now we will, it's time for a brief break before our last session of the conference. Please don't go anywhere. We will be back at 12:30.
Bye. Salamat.